For months, local shelter workers had seen the sorrow in the eyes of a cat named Marbles as he awaited his fate in the crowded shelter. The day came when Marbles was to be put to sleep, a last resort for the overburdened shelter. But as the vet prepared for the procedure, he noticed something about Marbles that stopped him dead in his tracks. The vet's eyes widened with shock as he shouted, "This can't be true!" "Dr. James, everything okay?" one of the veterinarian nurses asked worriedly when Dr. James hesitated to put down Marbles. He stood frozen in the room with the needle in his hand and his eyes fixed on the cat. Without saying another word, he leaned forward, looking at something only he had seen. Suddenly, he shot upright and yelled, "This can't be true!" Everyone in the room got silent, all waiting for an explanation, but none came. Instead, Dr. James walked out of the room, leaving everyone behind. Meanwhile, Marbles was still lying peacefully on the table, unsure of what was going on around him. Sophie, the vet's assistant, quickly ran after Dr. James. She had to know what he had seen. Dr. James was clearly upset about something, but Sophie couldn't understand what. His face was pale, and there was sweat dripping down his forehead. "Dr. James, what is it?" she asked him worriedly. She never would have guessed what he said next. But what was going on with Marbles? What did Dr. James see? And why was he acting so secretive? It wasn't the first time the local animal shelter had ordered one of their animals to be put to sleep. There were just too many animals in need of a home and not enough homes that wanted a pet. It was a difficult decision, but it was one that had to be made. This time, it was Marbles' fate, a cat that had been at the shelter for multiple years. Everyone at the shelter loved Marbles, and that was one of the reasons why it was such a hard decision to put him down. Over the years, he had won over many hearts, but sadly, not the right ones, as no one could provide a forever home for him. He came with various medical necessities, and not everyone was willing to take up such a big responsibility. Marbles wasn't having the best time at the shelter either. Everyone could see the pain in his eyes. Sometimes he even cried real tears as he cowered in the corner of his kennel, which also didn't help him get a forever home. Most people felt sorry for him instead of falling in love with him and wanting to take him in. It was a vicious circle that had to be ended. So Dr. James was called to get the job done. He was their usual veterinarian who also came by the shelter to do routine health checkups on the animals. So it was no surprise he was called this time as well. What was a surprise, though, was how Dr. James would react upon seeing Marbles. At first, everything seemed fine. Dr. James was his cheerful self, trying to lighten the mood in such a difficult time. While the shelter staff tried to hold in their tears, Dr. James comforted them. He was in his element. He knew exactly what to do. Then, Marbles was carried into the room and the staff members could say their final goodbyes. Everyone had their moment with Marbles, who in turn enjoyed every second of all the cuddles and kisses. Some staff members were too overcome with emotion and had to leave the room. Then it was time to put Marbles down. Dr. James got everything ready and everyone left inside the room mentally prepared themselves. But then Dr. James suddenly stopped. "Dr. James? Everything all right?" one of the veterinarian staff asked. They could see Dr. James's eyes fixed on one specific point. At one point, Sophie, the vet's assistant, could have sworn she saw his eyes well up with tears. "This can't be true," he suddenly exclaimed. Then, he just walked out of the room. No one understood what was going on, so Sophie ran after him. Dr. James looked like he had seen a ghost. It even scared Sophie a little bit. She had never seen her boss like this before. "Dr. James?" she asked with a shaky voice. "What's going on?" She feared it had something to do with Marbles. Could he be sick? Or was it something entirely different? Suddenly, Dr. James sighed. "I can't believe this," he uttered. "What?" Sophie asked. "You can't believe what?" But Dr. James didn't answer. He just looked at her. Then he suddenly turned away. "I can't do this," he said as he walked out of the room. Sophie followed behind him, thinking he was heading back to the operating room, but he actually left the animal shelter and drove off in his car. Sophie was left behind, confused and kind of in shock. This wasn't the Dr. James she knew and looked up to. She had to walk back to the operating room to let everyone know they had to postpone putting down marbles, but without an answer to any questions they had. When everyone was settled down, Sophie left the shelter to look for Dr. James. Sophie drove to the veterinarian clinic, hoping he would be there tending to his other clients for the day. But when she arrived there, she instantly noticed the state of panic everyone was in. "What's going on?" she asked the front desk assistant. Dr. James suddenly cancelled all his appointments for the day. Taking control, Sophie's clear voice cut through the noise. "Let's get organised," she said confidently. As she gave out tasks, the staff's anxiety remained palpable. As she assigned tasks, a sense of urgency remained. The air was thick with unspoken fears and speculation about Dr. James's abrupt exit. Their quick movements and hushed conversations hinted at their deep concern about Dr. James's sudden disappearance. Sophie's leadership brought some order, but everyone could feel the unease. Sophie then carefully reviewed the day's schedule. She quickly set to work, rearranging everyone's appointments with other veterinarians, ensuring no patient was overlooked. Each change she made was a reminder of Dr. James's unexpected absence. She managed to keep the clinic running, but there was a strange feeling in the air. The unanswered questions about Dr. James hung over everything like a dark cloud. Sophie addressed each phone call and every walk-in client with a calm and steady voice, providing reassurance and updates. But inside, she felt a constant gnawing feeling. The steady stream of worried pet owners only added to the day's strangeness. With each question about Dr. James, Sophie's own curiosity about his mysterious behaviour grew. This unusual day at the clinic was turning into a riddle that Sophie felt compelled to solve. In a rare moment of quiet, Sophie sat back and thought about the day's events. Dr. James's strange departure, the chaos that followed, and her efforts to manage it. It all seemed like a puzzle with missing pieces. She felt a growing sense of unease, the unanswered questions about Dr. James creating a lingering sense of mystery in her mind. Sophie started asking the front desk staff about the last time they saw Dr. James. Each person told her a little bit about that day, but their stories didn't give her a clear picture. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces didn't fit. The more she heard, the more confused she became. Everyone remembered Dr. James being there, but no one knew exactly what was wrong. The receptionist remembered Dr. James looking rushed and worried, which was strange for him. He was usually calm and collected. "He seemed really upset about something," she said, looking concerned. This was unusual for Dr. James and made Sophie even more curious. She wondered what could possibly be so upsetting about putting down marbles. It wasn't as if this was his first time putting down a cat. As Sophie talked to more people, she realized everyone was as confused and worried as she was. They all said Dr. James wasn't acting like himself. Their worry made Sophie even more determined to find out what had happened to Dr. James. But it was frustrating. She felt like she was missing something important, but she didn't know what it was. One of Sophie's colleagues remembered Dr. James driving away in the direction of a neighbourhood he visited regularly to find stray animals in need of help. This caught Sophie's attention. Maybe this neighbourhood had something to do with Dr. James's sudden disappearance. It was a small lead, but it was the only one she had. She decided it was worth checking out, hoping it might lead her to Dr. James. She decided to visit the old neighbourhood her colleague had mentioned. It might give her some clues about where Dr. James went. What if this lead was the key to the whole mystery? Sophie quickly gathered her things, her mind racing with thoughts of what she might find. Her heart was racing in her chest as she prepared to leave. She was worried about Dr. James, but also curious about what she might discover. This sure was unlike any other day she had on the job. The unknown was both scary and exciting. Sophie reached the old neighbourhood. It looked like it hadn't changed in years. The houses were old and the streets were quiet. She parked her car along the road and took a deep breath. She was going to start looking for Dr. James here, in this forgotten part of town. Sophie walked slowly down the quiet streets, her eyes scanning the old, seemingly abandoned homes. They stood silent, their windows like blank eyes watching her pass. The stillness of the neighborhood was eerie. The homes, once filled with life, now looked forgotten, their stories hidden behind peeling paint and overgrown gardens. This place felt like a ghost town, stuck in a time long past. As she walked, Sophie's thoughts turned to Dr. James and marbles. She remembered the vet's gentle manner with the sad-eyed cat. What was the link between Dr. James's sudden departure and marbles? It felt like pieces of a puzzle were slowly coming together, but the full picture was still unclear. The deeper Sophie walked into the neighborhood, the more she felt a sense of unease creeping over her. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. The deserted streets and the shadows lurking around the old houses made her feel like she was being watched. It was a stark contrast to the busy, noisy clinic she was used to. This quiet was unsettling, making her heart beat a little faster and her senses more alert. Suddenly, Sophie's heart skipped a beat. There, parked on the side of the road, was a car that looked a lot like Dr. James's. The sight of the familiar vehicle in such an unexpected place gave her a flicker of hope amidst the uncertainty. Her mind raced with possibilities as she slowly approached the car. She stopped walking, taking in the quiet, desolate surroundings. This was the moment to find answers, to uncover the truth about Dr. James's mysterious behavior. She was stepping into the unknown, but she knew she had to keep going. Sophie's eyes fixated on Dr. James's car parked outside a neglected house. The windows were covered in dust, and the gardens were wild and overgrown. The house looked like it hadn't been touched in years. It stood there, a sad reminder of better times, its worn exterior hinting at long-forgotten stories. Sophie felt her heart pounding as she stared at the car, confirming she was in the right place. With a deep breath, Sophie carefully approached the house. Its eerie silence was almost deafening. The door creaked as she pushed it open, stepping into a world that seemed frozen in time. The air was thick with the scent of old memories, and each step felt heavy, like she was walking through the pages of a history long left behind. Inside, the living room was a scene from another era, covered in a layer of dust. Old furniture, faded photographs and personal belongings lay scattered, each telling a tale of the past. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a snapshot of life that once was. The stillness was overwhelming, the silence broken only by the sound of Sophie's careful steps. Sophie moved cautiously through the house, her eyes scanning the rooms. Each space was a gallery of memories, with old toys, books, and family pictures hinting at a life once lived here. The walls, peeling with old paint, seemed to whisper secrets of days gone by. It was a house full of stories, each room holding echoes of laughter and tears. As she explored further, Sophie noticed a door slightly ajar, a sliver of light escaping from within. The light cast shadows on the walls, creating a mysterious and suspenseful atmosphere. Sophie stepped inside, ready to uncover whatever secrets lay waiting in the dimly lit room. Sophie slowly pushed open the creaking door and saw Dr. James sitting among old toys and peeling wallpaper. The room looked like it belonged to a child, with faded colours and worn-out furniture. Dr. James sat quietly, surrounded by relics of the past. The sight of him, so deep in thought amidst the remnants of childhood, was both surprising and startling. Sophie spoke softly, not wanting to startle him. "Dr. James?" she almost whispered. He looked up, seeming to slowly come back to the present. His eyes showed a mix of surprise and confusion at seeing Sophie there. "Sophie? What are you doing here?" he confusedly said, his voice breaking from being quiet for a long time. "I came to find you." After a pause, Dr. James began to speak. His voice was hesitant at first, as if he was finding it hard to share his thoughts. "This is my old family home," he said. He told Sophie about growing up in this house, his words filling the room with echoes of a distant past. It was clear that being here brought back many emotions for him. Dr. James explained that the room they were in was his when he was a boy. He looked around at the old toys and pictures, his face showing a mix of sadness and nostalgia. This place was a treasure chest of his early memories, each object holding a piece of his history. "What happened back at the shelter?" Sophie carefully asked. Dr. James's voice softened as he shared memories of his childhood in the house. "This was my world," he said, gazing around the room. He talked about playing with his toys, the adventures he imagined in these four walls, and the sense of safety and love the house once held. Each memory seemed to bring him both joy and sorrow, as if he was reliving those moments. "But what does this have to do with marbles?" She looked at Dr. James with kind eyes, hoping he would tell her more about the connection, but he fell silent. She could see some kind of pain in his eyes, but couldn't understand why it was there. "Please, Dr. James, we have to get back to the shelter." Suddenly, something seemed to click with Dr. James. "You're right," he said as she shook his head, "but I want to show you one last thing." He stood up and began to look around the room. He was clearly searching for something, and Sophie was eager to find out what. Maybe this could be the explanation she was looking for. Dr. James picked up an old picture frame of a teenage boy holding a kitten. "This is me with my kitten. He went missing, and I never saw him again. Marbles has a unique mark that is just like my kitten's," he said, his voice filled with wonder. The resemblance was so striking that he wondered if it was the same cat. Sophie could see in his eyes that this discovery had deeply affected him. At first, Dr. James couldn't believe the resemblance was real. He thought it was just a strange coincidence. "It couldn't be," he muttered, recalling his initial reaction. He had tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. The possibility seemed too far-fetched, too unlikely. Yet, the similarity was undeniable, and he couldn't get it out of his head. The realization of Marbles' resemblance to his lost kitten overwhelmed Dr. James with a flood of emotions. Hope mingled with disbelief. Could it really be? He wondered aloud. The thought that after all these years, his beloved pet might have returned to him in some way was both thrilling and unsettling. It was a lot for him to take in, and Sophie could see the turmoil in his eyes. The possibility that Marbles might be his long-lost kitten weighed heavily on Dr. James. He was caught in a whirlwind of emotions, hope, confusion, and a fear of being wrong. What if it's just a coincidence? He pondered, his voice tinged with uncertainty. This thought left him torn between embracing a long-lost connection and protecting himself from potential disappointment. Sophie reached out, offering words of comfort. "It's okay to feel this way," she said gently. She encouraged Dr. James to explore these feelings rather than push them away. "Sometimes, life brings us unexpected moments that might seem unbelievable at first," she added, hoping to help him navigate this emotional storm. Her presence and understanding offered a much-needed anchor in his sea of tumultuous emotions. Sophie gently suggested to Dr. James that Marbles' arrival could be a chance for healing, no matter the truth behind their resemblance. "Maybe this is an opportunity for closure," she said softly. Her words seemed to light a spark in Dr. James's eyes. He nodded slowly, considering the idea that this unexpected encounter could help him come to terms with the past, regardless of whether Marbles was truly his long-lost kitten. Inspired by Sophie's perspective, Dr. James made a decision. He would adopt Marbles. It wasn't just about the possibility of a past connection. It was about giving Marbles a loving home. "He deserves a second chance, just like anyone else," Dr. James said with newfound resolve. His decision was made not out of certainty about Marbles' identity, but out of compassion and a desire to make a difference. Together, Sophie and Dr. James returned to the shelter. This time, Dr. James walked with a sense of purpose and hope. The drive back was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken understanding and anticipation. As they neared the shelter, Dr. James seemed more at peace, ready to start a new chapter with Marbles. At the shelter, Dr. James officially adopted Marbles. He filled out the paperwork and gently picked up the cat, promising to care for him with all the love he had. "You're coming home with me," he whispered to Marbles. The cat, sensing the change, nuzzled against Dr. James, as if understanding that this was the beginning of a new, happier life. As they left the shelter, Dr. James and Sophie paused for a moment. They looked back at the building that had been the setting for such an extraordinary series of events. "Life is full of surprises," Dr. James mused. They both knew that this experience had changed them. For Dr. James, it was closing a painful chapter of his past, and for Sophie, it was witnessing the power of empathy and understanding. Marbles quickly took to his new home, exploring each room with a mix of curiosity and excitement. He sniffed around, finding cozy spots and looking out the windows with wide eyes. The house, once quiet, now echoed with the soft patter of his paws. Dr. James watched, a smile on his face, as Marbles claimed the space as his own, bringing life and warmth into the home. Each day, the bond between Dr. James and Marbles grew stronger. They developed a routine, with Marbles greeting him at the door and following him around the house. In the evenings, Marbles would curl up on Dr. James's lap, purring contentedly. These moments of connection were simple but profound, a daily reminder of the new friendship they had formed. In a quiet moment, Dr. James sat, watching Marbles sleep peacefully. He thought about the unexpected way Marbles had come into his life. This little cat had brought back so much from the past, yet also opened the door to a new future. Dr. James felt grateful for this unexpected turn of events. Caring for Marbles became a therapeutic experience for Dr. James. He found joy in the daily routines of feeding, playing, and just being with Marbles. Each day eased the pain of his past losses a little more. In Marbles, he found not just a pet, but a companion who helped him heal old wounds and look forward to each new day. The story ends with Dr. James and Marbles in a scene of contentment. They sit together, Marbles purring softly as Dr. James strokes his fur. There's a sense of peace between them, a bond forged by shared experiences and mutual comfort. Looking out the window, Dr. James feels hopeful about the future, knowing that whatever it holds, they will face it together.